Okay, so we're in John, open your Bibles to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And last week, as you recall, in John chapter 8, at the very end, Jesus has kind of ticked off the Pharisees because he had said that before Abraham was, I am. And so by saying I am, he used a term, a name for God that was exclusive to God. And so it really made the Pharisees mad. They picked up rocks. They were going to kill him with rocks. And so Jesus kind of walks away from there. So that's kind of where it ended. And then we find Jesus here in chapter 9. It says, and as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Okay. In the Gospels, we've got no other place that indicates a person who was born with like a blindness or any kind of type of a disease or anything like that. This is the only place in Scripture that we haven't mentioned as far as in the Gospels. In Acts, we see a couple of places where somebody was born with a malady, type of a thing. So, anyway, so we have this here, and so the disciples ask him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned? I know, Rob, you're probably familiar with this, but when you come across a major accident, there's two types of groups that appear there. First group is the police department. Usually the police show up, they kind of hold everybody back, they get everything set up, they try to investigate, they look for skid marks, they do all their different things, take pictures, and their whole purpose or intent is to find out who's at fault. And so that's the job of the police officers. Whose fault was it? Why did this happen? Then you have the paramedics that show up on the scene, and they're not concerned about whose fault it is. All they're concerned about is helping somebody get better, helping them, if they're bleeding, to stop the bleeding, that kind of thing. And so that's what they typically do. So these two types of people show up. Well, the disciples are kind of like the cops or the police, because they want to know who sinned that this guy was born blind. And so there was a belief that was being taught. And, if we look at, was it the parents or the man? Well, if the man sinned, then he would have had to do it before he was born, because he was born with that, with blindness. And so it was taught in those days that you could actually commit sin while you're in the mother's womb. And by the Jews believed that based on, remember Esau and Jacob when they were duking it out in the mother's womb, the fighting between two nations and that kind of a thing. And so based on that, they said, well, it's possible to actually sin before you're born. So saying, did he sin, type of a thing. The other thing that was kind of a main belief that was happening right then is the rabbis had kind of adopted Plato's teachings. And Plato believed that before people were born, they were spirits. So they existed in heavens, if you would, as spirits, some good spirits, some bad spirits. And so they would come and live in a body. And so they were thinking that maybe they were good spirit or bad spirit, maybe they were bad spirits. So that could be the issue. The Mormons today believe that. They were spirits before we're born, that we come, we live in a body. And the whole purpose of that is to see if we can actually discover the truth of Mormonism and therefore, live that out, become a good Mormon, eventually become a god of our own planet and that kind of a thing. But it's all based on this belief that they're spirits before they're born. And that's not what the Bible teaches. So we've got this background there. Who sinned? Was it these parents or was it the man himself? What's interesting is a lot of times we want to blame God for things that go bad. What did we do? How do we sin? Why is God punishing us for something like this? So we see someone who's sick, we see someone who's going through a really hard time, and so sometimes we want to say, well, God's doing something to maybe correct it in their life or whatever. And that's not the case. Remember, probably the most famous story was that of, I just lost his name. In the Old Testament.
About what?
Job?
Job, thank you. I knew you would get it. That's why you're here.
That was a test.
That's a test. I really know. I was just trying to guess, see if you guys... So you remember Job and his story, that his friends thought he had committed some kind of sin. They said, just confess to God and all this will go away. And he had lost his family, he had lost his home, he had lost his health. But if we get the background of the story, and we look at the real story of what was happening, we see that it was the devil had come to, before God, and basically it said, you're protecting Job, and so that's why he loves you, and that's why he worships you, because you protect him so much. But if you pull that protection away, then what's going to happen is that he won't love you anymore. And so God says, okay, go ahead, just don't take his life, long and short. And so we see this battle going on, and so his friends thought, well, it's because of Job had sinned. And it wasn't the case at all. It's because the devil was whooping on him, type of a thing. Okay? Sometimes today people think that as well. They think that it's because of something you've done.
Not believers so much, though, right?
What's that?
I don't recall since becoming a believer that other believers would say that. It's the world.
No, actually, it's the believers sometimes that say that because of bad teaching. They've been taught that God punishes, and the world believes that. A lot of the world, but believers believe that. Some of the crazy things that some of the believers teach and believe. In fact, and it's based on this concept. John said that Moses came to bring the law, but Jesus came to bring grace and truth. Okay. There's basically two styles of ministry you see with pastors, and that's where people get this concept of God punishing them. Some pastors model their ministry after Moses, if you would. It's more of a condemnation type thing, hellfire, brimstone, you're all going to hell, get it together, and then even preaching to the church. And then you've got the Jesus style of ministry, it's about grace. And so we get that going on there. So the people who've styled their ministry after Moses, they have this concept they're teaching, and that's where people pick that up, is they begin to think, well, obviously you've sinned or something's going bad in your life because that's why you're going through this hard time. If you were truly had faith in God, or if you truly were following God or living your life following the teachings of God, that you weren't blowing it, then none of this stuff would be happening in your life. And so there's people that believe that. So we find here that the disciples are saying, well, who sinned? Okay, who sinned? Well, sin does have, in many respects, have a connection to sickness and disease. Because it is in a general sense, not because a person sins so he's going to get a sickness, although that could happen. Okay? But a lot of sin is connected with, a lot of sickness is connected with people actually sin. They're born as sinners. When Adam and Eve sinned, it brought sin into the world. It brought sickness and disease and everything else with it into the world. And so we've got that sitting in here. And so with that sitting there, then that will sometimes bring sickness upon a person if they are involved with certain kinds of sins. So what God has done, even as he did back in the time of Adam and Eve, he gave warnings. He says, don't eat of that tree in the middle of the garden. If you eat of that tree, you're going to die. And so in that case, God actually said, here's what the result will be if you eat of that tree. Today we have people who commit sins and sinful lifestyles, and because of that, they get certain diseases. Maybe it's HIV or something else that comes into their life because they've gone against the laws of God. They're interpreting it as God being a big bully and saying, you can't, because he doesn't want us to have fun. But in reality, what God's doing is a loving God. He's saying, don't do that because the result will be this. You're going to hurt yourself if you do that. It's kind of like we've got our grandkids here today, and I know when our kids were growing up, we have to warn them about certain things. Don't put your finger in the wall socket. If we've got a lamp sitting there, don't put your finger in the socket where the light bulb goes in, or you're going to get shocked. And so if they went up and did that, let's say they went up and stuck their finger in the socket and got shocked, they'd say, Daddy, why did you shock me? Well, Daddy didn't shock him. Daddy warned him and said, don't stick your finger in there, you're going to get shocked. Okay? So it's like that with God. God's not the one who's doing it. God's warning and saying, don't do certain things, because if you do, there'll be a result. And so Jesus came to share with us what the true nature of God is. And so we're going to see now in this story what Jesus does to kind of bring that about. So they say, okay, Jesus, who sinned? Was it the parents or was it the son? And Jesus answered and said, it was neither. That this man sinned, nor that his parents. Now, in my Bible and in most translations, there's a semicolon there. And I'll explain why that's an important thing that I believe should be a period. Okay, in the original Greek language, there are no punctuation marks. Okay, I believe that when Jesus said neither, he was done with the statement. He answered the question. Well, there's a semicolon in my Bible. I'm going to read it and show you how you could possibly interpret it and how some people interpret it, which I believe is a wrong interpretation. And so he says this. Verse 3. Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. So if we leave the semicolon in there, it leads us to believe that God was the one who made this man blind so that he could demonstrate his power. And that's what I believed for years. Some other versions, translations don't do that. They put a period in there. And I believe that, in my opinion, that the period is best suited for there because, like I say, in the original Greek manuscripts, there are no punctuations. So the people who are translating it put that in there to try to connect two thoughts that I believe were not connected. Jesus said neither sinned. Okay, now, because this man's blind, now we'll be able to see that the works of God will be done in his life. You see the difference?
Yeah.
So God did not design or predetermine this man to be blind so that he could show off and demonstrate his power. But what happened was, because this man was blind, God will demonstrate, or Jesus will demonstrate the power of God so that you'll be able to see that. If that makes sense?
Yep.
It does.
And then Jesus says this, we must work the works of him who sent me as long as this day. Night is coming when no man can work. And so Jesus is saying the works of the Father, the works of the one who sent me are basically to bring healing. You know, I think about that, and I think about us as the church. You know, I'm witnessing to and talking to people, some believers, some unbelievers right now that have addictions. They've got, you know, drinking problems, or they've got drug problems. In fact, I had several of them to come this morning. One guy actually texted me this morning and says, I can't come, I've been drinking, you know. And so I texted him back, are you drunk? Well, I don't know. And so I said, well, let's get together this week, you know, kind of a thing. But too often what the church does is point fingers at him like Moses and saying, it's because you are doing this and your life is messed up. Does that make sense? When actually, I believe what Christians should be doing is more of a paramedic and saying, how can we help you get out of this?
Yeah.
How can we help you fix this? We don't concern what the cause is so much. We want to get it fixed. That makes sense. And so Jesus came to show the nature of God as being one who wanted to fix them, not condemn them. Because remember, we talked about in John chapter 3 that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. So, you know, Jesus has come, and we're going to see that he's, again, mentions himself being the light, because he comes to put light out there, or show what God is really like, not what people have assumed him to be, or you know, have been taught to believe about God. Okay? All right, so let's move on. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. And so he went away and washed and came back seeing. So we've got the situation where Jesus, you know, decides to spit on the ground. He makes clay, puts it on the guy's eyes, and then says, go wash in that over there in that pool. And then you'll be able to see. Well, what's interesting, this was done on the Sabbath again. We're going to see Jesus bump heads again with the Pharisees because it was done on the Sabbath day. And so we see that the man did this, and he came back seeing. In verse 8, the neighbors therefore and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I'm the one. I used to be the blind beggar. Therefore they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? And here's what he answers. Okay, he answers and says, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? Where is he? He said, I do not know. So he's saying that I just know this man named Jesus. That's all I know. So we're going to see kind of a progressive revelation of who Jesus is to this man. He just knows him as a man. A guy that made clay in the dirt, put it on his eyes, told him to go wash. And so the people are kind of not quite sure if this is the same guy. They're wondering, okay, what happened? What's going on here? And we're going to see the Pharisees do the same thing. They're going to do the, you know, the double questioning, just okay, interrogation type of a deal, and see where that goes here. And then verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees him who was formerly blind. So they bring this guy, this blind, the guy who used to be blind, they bring him to the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees were the big religious leaders of the day. Okay, they were the teacher types. Okay, they're supposed to know the law really well, and they're supposed to know God really well. But they didn't know either that well. They knew the letter of the law, but they didn't know what God meant by the law. Okay, and again, therefore the Pharisees also were asking him how he received sight. And he said to them, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. So we get some of these Pharisees are saying that Jesus can't be, of God. He's got to be a sinner because he did work on the Sabbath. And he actually did two things on the Sabbath that were no-nos. Okay, he made clay. We're supposed to make clay on the Sabbath. Now the Sabbath day was the Saturday. The Bible says that that's supposed to be the day of rest. You're not supposed to do any work. Well, the Pharisees had created this code book full of these rules to try to interpret what God had meant. So to make clay was wrong on the Sabbath. To heal somebody was wrong, was sin on the Sabbath. You could help someone if they were going to die. You could keep them from dying, but you couldn't help them get well. So if a person was spraining their ankle, you couldn't put cold water on it or anything like that, or even to the ice, because that would be breaking the Sabbath. You couldn't wear shoes with the soles were fastened on with nails, because wearing shoes with nails would be a burden that you were carrying. The nails was a burden, and so that would be breaking the Sabbath. So they had all these ridiculous rules and things that would say you got to keep the law of the Sabbath. Well, Jesus, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was thinking as you were reading that he could have spoken that and healed him. But what you're saying is, either way, they were going to judge him.
They were going to judge him, but I think that he made the clay instead of speaking, because we have one case where he did speak, guy was healed. Another case, he laid hands on the guy, and he goes, "Can you see it?" He goes, "Well, they look like trees." And so Jesus laid his hand on it again, and they were healed. So Jesus could have spoke. He could have also laid hands on him.
Yeah.
But Jesus chose to do something else, and I'm convinced it was to just kind of push a little harder on the Sabbath teaching they had there. So he made clay instead of just doing those other things.
Yeah.
So either way, he would have been breaking the Sabbath because he healed him. So he did a double whammy in that he not only healed him, but he made the clay to do it the same way. So you can see that he's kind of pushing back a little bit on their man-made laws.
Yeah.
And so, but that's a good point that you bring that up. All right. So they brought him, let's see. Therefore some of the Pharisees were saying, "This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others were saying, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" So some were recognizing that Jesus wasn't a sinner, that he was from God because he was doing these signs and wonders. And, we've got other Pharisees that recognized that before that we talked about. Okay. So, verse 17. They said therefore to the blind man again, "What do you say about him since he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." So he went from being this man, he had opened his eyes, to being a prophet. And so there's this kind of a revelation that's happening to this guy. He's realizing that I think part of it's because of the conversation they're having, part of it's by the Spirit of God. Mm-hmm. But he's not just a man who did it. There's something's going on here. This guy's pretty special. So, now they ask him, "Who is this guy?" He says, "Well, he's a prophet." Okay? All right. The Jews therefore did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. So what happens is, we don't believe this guy. We think he's a phony. We don't believe he's really blind. So we're going to talk to his parents. So they call the parents in, okay, and to find out what's going on. So and they questioned him, saying, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?" His parents answered and said to them, "We know that he was our son, and we know that he is blind, or was born blind. So we know he's our son, we know he's born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know." Okay? Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him, he is of age. Excuse me. He shall speak for himself. Excuse me. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So they were afraid to answer. They probably knew the answer, but they didn't want to come across as being someone who was following Jesus because they'd get kicked out of church. Mm-hmm. And so the parents were afraid. They didn't want to get kicked out of church. All right? 24. So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He therefore answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see." So we've got this man who says, "I don't know anything about whether he's a sinner, his back, whatever, whoever. All I know is that once I was blind, now I see." A lot of us, if we've received Jesus, we can say, once I was, fill in the blank, but now I see. People who have been set free from drugs. Once I was a drug addict, but now I'm set free. They may not know anything else about Jesus. They just know what Jesus has done in their life. Okay, set them free from drugs, set them free from alcohol, whatever. All I know is, once I was addicted, now I'm free. And so we see that there, and so that's the response they give to Jesus. That ties in nicely with understanding the nature of Jesus, because Jesus, again, was not there to condemn. Jesus was there to set people free, and to set them free and set people free. We see that today, that Jesus is here to set people free. All right. He answered, they therefore said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? This guy's been telling a story, I don't know how many times so far. He answered them, I told you already, okay, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to because, try that again, I'm just having a hard time with it. We'll get it here. You do not want to because his disciples, you do not want to become his disciples too, do you? We'll get it there. And so this blind man is saying to the Pharisees that are already ticked about Jesus and ticked about people following him, and they want to kick people out of the churches for following him. He goes, oh, so you want to become a disciple too? That was not probably the smartest thing to say to these religious leaders. And so they got kind of a little bit angry, and they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. And so we see the contrast there, disciples of Jesus versus disciples of Moses. We kind of talked about that, the police officer versus the paramedic type thing. And this is not to blast police officers. Police officers have a great job, and they're there to do it. I'm just speaking spiritually of how we respond as Christians. Should we respond spiritually as a police officer, or should we respond as a paramedic? Mm-hmm. And so we see these two different discipleship camps there. And so the Pharisees are making it very clear, we're not one of Jesus' disciples. We are one of Moses' disciples. Verse 29, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as far as this man, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and God does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone open the eyes of a person who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. All right. They answered and said to him, you were born entirely in sin and are teaching us, and they put him out. So they kind of bouncing back to this belief that obviously you were blind because you had sinned. So they're basically saying this, you were born in sin and you're trying to lecture us. We're the Pharisees. We're the ones who know the law. We're the ones who are, there was a lot of pride going on there. Okay? Lots of pride going on there. All right? Let's see, let me go on. So anyway, they said, you were born entirely in sins, and you are teaching us, and they put him out. And so they kicked him out of the church, out of the temple, synagogue. You can no longer belong here, which is interesting because their desires, you can see, was not to help, was not to cure, was not to bring people closer to God. Their whole purpose was to kind of prove to everybody that they were right and everyone else was wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's not really a good thing to do. Okay? All right. Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? So Jesus hears that this guy has been kicked out of the temple, out of the synagogue. So he goes and finds him. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? In other words, do you believe in the Son of God? Do you believe Jesus is the Messiah? And so his response is kind of classic. He says this. He answered and said, and who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to them, you have both seen him, and he is one who is talking to you now. And he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." So Jesus is basically saying that you're blind and don't recognize it. If you would recognize that you didn't know everything, then you could be forgiven. Okay? Then you'd be able to see. But because of that, your blindness remains. In other words, you can't see what God wants you to see.